Cracker Barrel, a multi-billion-dollar company with a rich and storied past. Saying the name often evokes imagery of a better time, a home-cooked meal, and a rocking chair by the fire. But over the past few weeks in 2025, the company has become the subject of widespread backlash and, most of all, political controversy. Why, you may ask? Did they violate the Civil Rights Act? Did they step away from their core business model? Did they bicker internally with major shareholders and push policies that alienate most of their core customers? Yes, to all of that at one point or another. But the real thing that they did, the surface level catalyst behind Cracker Barrel becoming a mainstream scandal headline across potentially hundreds of separate media outlets, was a simple change of logo. In reality, what happened was a complex business pivot, including renovations, menu changes, and a genuine effort to pull the company onto more stable ground. Other restaurant chains like TGI Fridays or Red Lobster have both recently declared bankruptcy themselves, under the strain of post-COVID consumer spending retractions. But for Cracker Barrel, before they went down that same route, management decided to go out swinging. Just one problem, actually many problems, but the one that mattered most is that some people really do not like change. With a primary customer base that skews older and a general understanding that Cracker Barrel is a restaurant chain that heavily relies on nostalgia, the idea of getting a more modern experience didn't exactly generate excitement. The renovations weren't going over all that well. The changes to their menu were fine. Actually, those were almost completely unnoticed. But when the company decided to change their iconic logo, all bets were off. Almost instantaneously, politicians and larger social media influencers began speaking out about it. Congressmen, senators, prominent conservative pundits, even the president's own son, soon followed by the president himself, all piled on board, saying that the company should return to their previous logo and listen to their angry customers. The narrative quickly took shape that Cracker Barrel had gone woke, and if they kept on doing it, they would be completely finished, colloquially, going broke. Oddly enough, the load-bearing pillar of critical discourse seemed to completely ignore the idea of business fundamentals. Cracker Barrel was potentially making a mistake with all of this, but the self-evident reality is that they had to do something to try and stimulate their business model, and that something involved the idea of modernization. This is where it gets a little bit personal. The woman behind this initiative was Chief Executive Julie Masino, but when you look at her prior employment history, everything starts making a whole lot more sense. Julie Masino previously worked at Starbucks, Sprinkles Cupcakes, and Taco Bell. Hipster coffee, young people sweets, and corporate fast food. The idea that she would be at the helm of a modernization plan, which stepped away from their core customer base previously, that is also aging out of the retail spending market consistently now, by the way, the idea that she would do this is entirely unsurprising. Still, as much as I can readily admit that this new plan was kind of an obvious mistake, why is it that a corporation with a shitty rebrand becomes a political lightning rod of the culture war? I'm old enough now to remember a time when a company changing logos wouldn't even cross the desk of our politicians, let alone cause them to rally around condemning it. So why was it that Cracker Barrel was now the latest target of the conservative political influence machine? This may seem like a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. Here's something I find to be incredibly interesting. How many people knew that despite the vocal criticism aimed at Cracker Barrel in the short term, calling the company woke in its current form, how many people know that the corporation actually has a very complicated history when it comes to minority groups? A lot of people may not be aware of this, but in the early 90s, Cracker Barrel held an explicit written policy where, quote, employees whose sexual preferences failed to demonstrate normal heterosexual values would be fired, end quote, which led to mass protests and boycotts of the restaurant as a direct result of it. Not only that, but after a race discrimination lawsuit in the early 2000s, about 10 years later, Cracker Barrel became the only company, again, the only company under the Bush administration to face an actual DOJ settlement for racial discrimination, which found that the company had been openly segregating, allowing waitstaff to refuse service, deliberately providing inferior service, and a whole bunch more, frankly, shocking abuses of their clients, specifically when it came to African American customers. Cracker Barrel was blatantly violating Title II of the Civil Rights Act, all the way into the early 2000s. Of course, 2004 is over 20 years ago now, which seems like a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, it really isn't that long, and I think it's worth mentioning before we get to the rest of the video. Criticism of Cracker Barrel, after politicians and even the president piled on board, was coming in thick and fast, with special emphasis on Julie Masino herself. But it turns out, to some degree, it was deserved. Hindsight's 2020. I can sit here after the fact and say, obviously the plan to modernize a nostalgic brand would cause an abundance of problems. But it turns out Cracker Barrel was explicitly warned about this by one of their largest individual shareholders repeatedly. Biglari Capital Corporation, which owns like 9 or 10% of the shares outstanding as per the making of this video, in both letters and a detailed 120-page PowerPoint presentation, outlined how and why the rebrand was, quote, obvious folly. Of course, this is also an open call for changes in leadership, which appear to be highly contested, so criticizing this plan was also self-serving to a degree when it comes to internal politics. Sardar Biglari, so it would seem, is attempting to undermine the current Cracker Barrel executive board in a sort of investor power struggle, which Cracker Barrel has repeatedly been warning about. They say things like significant risk of shareholder value destruction if Mr. Biglari is elected to the board. But the point is, Cracker Barrel was being warned that their new plan was an obvious misstep, well and truly before they ever became a national headline. Suffice it to say, Cracker Barrel ignored those warnings, hired the CEO with hipster business and detached corporate experience, implemented a plan that seemed fundamentally at odds with their existing customer base, and was now reaping the downside of those blunders. But what about consequences? I've talked a lot about public outcry, but what about real tangible consequences and subsequent changes? During this whole process, the stock price very obviously took a hit, but truthfully, in context, it doesn't even really register. Stock price fluctuations are very often held up by novice commentators as a huge indicator of company health, especially during a period of public scandal. But in this case, I think it's important to understand that Cracker Barrel has been struggling on its fundamentals for years. The stock is taking hits, or rallying for that matter, left and right and center, with completely unrelated reasons behind them, which make me skeptical that a temporary 14% decline, which is what happened on the day of their logo change during the bulk of the outcry, it makes me skeptical that that a temporary price drop like that had practically anything to do with their decisions on this. But regardless of why, political pressure, customer pressure, whatever the reasons were, ultimately they decided on reversing the logo change, thereby appeasing the angry masses. In essence, it seems like a simple case. Of course, the White House, as in Donald Trump himself, right? That's what we're talking about when we say the White House, took personal credit for that decision, with multiple statements by staffers, even so far as to say, quote, from the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, quote, President Trump spoke, Cracker Barrel listened, end quote, which is about as on the nose as you can possibly get. The thing is, though, okay, and this is where it gets much more interesting, they didn't just stop at the logo. It appears that Cracker Barrel is now making a concerted effort to appease their conservative critics, taking steps to remove any mention whatsoever of pride or DEI from their website. We can see that these two pages are now gone inexplicably, but Internet Archives show that up until shortly after the entire disaster took place, they looked a lot more like this. Cracker Barrel asserts that they simply made routine changes and removed out-of-date content, but it's a little bit difficult for me to look at the entire situation in context and see anything other than a calculated effort to try and appease the mob. Further underscoring that possibility, it turns out that shortly before this entire disaster kicked off, America First Legal, whose founder and president is a man named Stephen Miller, who currently serves as senior advisor to the president, as in Donald Trump, America First Legal formally petitioned the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Tennessee Attorney General to investigate Cracker Barrel over what they claimed were discriminatory policies, which coincidentally were listed on the same two web pages, which are now deleted. I know it's a bit conspiratorial, but connect the dots with me here. Cracker Barrel gets targeted by a conservative organization founded and presided over by the senior advisor to the president, who calls for the company to be investigated. Shortly afterward, they innocuously changed their logo, but the president and his son immediately used their massive platforms to galvanize their political bases against that company. Shortly after that, the company reverses their intended rebrand and quietly deletes the very same website pages pertaining to the initiatives that were causing the current administration to target them in the first place, attempting to not only diffuse public tension, but also subtly realign themselves with the current political powers after whipsawing back and forth over the span of decades, somehow managing to become the racist company that openly discriminates in the eyes of diametrically opposed political parties. That is quite the accomplishment, if you ask me. Going beyond a surface-level analysis, it very much feels like a bigger story is buried deep down under the drama. Trump's own senior advisor weaponizes the EEOC against Cracker Barrel, which coincidentally happens after a protracted campaign by Sardar Biglari, who owns and controls a competing restaurant called Steak and Shake. Cracker Barrel has been fighting off his advances into their company for multiple years. But suddenly, when they execute a rebrand, hordes of conservative influencers and politicians, including Donald Trump himself, pile on board, followed by a visit from RFK Jr. to Steak and Shake, while they repeatedly weaponize the branding and existing influence of the MAGA movement to advance Big Larry's goals. Sardar Big Larry is also a Trump campaign political donor. Not very large amounts, mind you, but when you combine everything together, it no longer feels like a simple company with a run-of-the-mill logo change, where the public just happened to not like it. Quite the contrary, in fact. The Cracker Barrel disaster isn't so simple as a rebrand gone wrong. It's a complicated story of internal failure, power struggles, political outrage in a structured way on top of that, immediately after the current administration targeted the business to begin with, and most of all, the rapidly shifting tides of cultural dominance, when just 20 years ago, the very same company was the only case of racial discrimination pursued by the Justice Department, and it was an egregious example as well, because they were openly segregating in the early 2000s. Flash forward, and the company is now under siege because of their DEI programs, as in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Cracker Barrel became a proxy for the culture war, not because they necessarily deserve to be, at least not more so than plenty of other corporate brands out there, but because they've made it exceptionally easy. They've landed on both sides of the extreme in short enough of a time period where people can still remember it, while in the same breath building their business around older customers who were definitely old enough to remember all of it. In the end, what we see on the surface is a logo change, but what's happening in the background is political activism, calls for investigations, internal and complex shareholder power grabs, and the creeping but certainly justified sense that corporations are slowly eradicating everything that feels unique in favor of generic, bland, and boring minimalism. The Cracker Barrel logo, the new one at least, certainly felt like an extension of that behavior, which we see echoed across practically every single industry, service, and large-scale business. That's it. As always, the Cracker Barrel disaster isn't quite as simple as it would seem, especially not if you only read headlines or social media posts, but in the end, we may never actually know the full story. I've heard speculation that they only did this as a ploy, renovating their bottom-performing restaurants to make them more generic and sellable, to then knowingly reverse the changes afterwards, selling those locations off to other brands in a perfectly executed PR stunt, simultaneously awarding them the title of a brand that listens when the outrage inevitably came rolling in. I have no idea if that's true, but if it is true, it would be genius. Anyway, if you want to support the channel, check out the links down below, a special VPN deal, locals and Patreon, monthly subscriptions, channel memberships, etc., etc. But I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, question everything, and have a nice night.